Seja bem-vindo e bem-vinda ao nosso canal. Este evento é organizado pelo Escritório da UNESCO no Brasil. Ele discutirá questões relevantes para todos e cobrirá uma das 5 áreas do mandato da UNESCO: educação, ciências naturais, ciências humanas e sociais, cultura, comunicação e informação. Contudo, esclarecemos que as indicações de nomes e a apresentação do material ao longo deste evento não implicam a manifestação de qualquer opinião por parte da UNESCO a respeito da condição jurídica de qualquer país, território, cidade, região ou de suas autoridades, tampouco da delimitação de suas fronteiras ou limites. Assim, as ideias e as opiniões expressas neste evento são a dos participantes e não refletem obrigatoriamente as da UNESCO, nem comprometem a organização. Acompanhe os canais da UNESCO para outros eventos e ações da organização.
Boa tarde. Boa tarde
Good
a todos
afternoon
no auditório do Instituto de Educação da Universidade de Lisboa.
to all of you attending this event at the University of Lisbon. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you joining us online, especially those of you in Brazil, but also in Africa and in other geographies. Thank you very much for attending yet another seminar on the future or the futures of education. Today we have a very special person with us, Professor Leonardo Garnier, who is the Special Counsel for the United Nations Secretary for the Education Summit, Transforming Education. In 2021, on the occasion of the 74th anniversary of the United Nations, Secretary General Guterres launched a program titled Our Common Agenda. As part of that program, there was an essential pillar, which was the education pillar. Actually, as part of our common agenda launched by the UN, there are 3 major initiatives: the Education Summit, Transforming Education, held back in 2022, and later on, the Future Summit, held in 2024, and finally, the Social World Summit in 2025, which will bring to a close the cycle of large-scale international events on our common agenda. Today, we are all here focused on the Education Summit, Transforming Education. And Professor Garnier, a former Minister of Education in Costa Rica, and also the main person currently responsible for the upcoming Education Summit as appointed by the United Nations Secretary General. Professor Garnier will talk to us about this summit, about the problems involving or facing education in the world from a United Nations perspective. And that is what we're going to be addressing here today. As we hear from one of the most responsible persons for this matter, perhaps the most responsible person on the matter at hand, responsible for thinking about education from a global perspective. It is very important for us to understand the ideas, the messages, the proposals, the issues which in the framework of the upcoming Education Summit, and initiatives are currently being carried out in and from New York. To that end, my friends, it'll be, of course, best for us to hear straight from Professor Garnier, whom I am most thankful for joining us in this cycle of conferences or seminars on the futures of education. Leonardo, thank you so much. You have the floor. You have the floor, sir, for the presentation. At the end, by the way, at the end of the presentation, we will have questions which I will myself read out. But of course, if anyone in the audience here in Lisbon would like to voice their questions, you are welcome to do so. And I myself will ask one or two questions to Professor Garnier at the end of his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you for having me here today to talk about the futures of education. It's been 50 years since the publication of Sakharopoulos' seminal book on the returns to education, where he rigorously demonstrated what most teachers and educators already knew, both from intuition and from experience. While education is much more than just an economic investment, the fact is that in simple economic terms, education pays. 5 decades of research and the experience of many countries have confirmed this time and again. Investing in education is one of the best, if not the best, investment a country can make in order to increase income and improve the material well-being of its population. And yet, despite what we might know about the importance of education, the truth is that across the world, education is in deep crisis. On the one hand, it is a crisis of equity and inclusion, as millions remain out of school. Worldwide, almost 250 million children are out of school, including nearly half of the refugee children. 1 in every 4 young persons are excluded from education, training, or employment, and almost 800 million youth and adults remain illiterate, the majority of them women. Even if countries were to achieve those targets they set for themselves in the Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education, it is estimated that 84 million children and youth will still be out of school in 2030, and 300 million students will still lack the basic numeracy and literacy skills they need to succeed and lead a meaningful life. On the other hand, it is also a crisis of quality and relevance, as many of those who do have access to schooling are not even learning the basics, let alone more complex competencies like creative, critical, scientific thinking, digital skills, and socio-emotional or civic competences. This crisis of equity and access and of quality and relevance in education are, of course, the result of complex and often interrelated causes. They are the product of personal and social circumstances that hinder the ability to attend and pay for the direct and indirect costs of education, as well as the ability to learn, as students are confronted with poor nutrition and health, insufficient early stimulation, the effects of gender stereotypes, or time constraints on study. Educational exclusion and learning barriers also include an intergenerational and historical element. In fact, one of the main predictors of educational achievement of children and adolescents is the level of income and schooling of the adults responsible for the household, particularly the mother. These inequalities are often further amplified by the very education systems that should be solving this problem, as quality educational opportunities do not really reach those who need them the most. We know that today's education gaps in access, participation, and outcomes are often based on yesterday's exclusions and oppression. The long-term consequences of this crisis are enormous. It is estimated that learning poverty, defined as a child's ability to read and understand a simple text at age 10, worsened from 58% to 70% in low and lower middle-income countries during the pandemic. The mere economic impact of learning poverty implies that this generation of students risks losing $25 trillion in present value in potential lifetime earnings, or the equivalent of 17% of today's global GDP. That's huge. Of course, education is much more than merely an economic investment with very high rates of return. As the UN Secretary General emphasized in his vision statement at the Transforming Education Summit last year, education, the right to learn, must be understood holistically in terms of four key dimensions of which UNESCO has been mentioning for a long time. First, they must learn to learn. This starts with their ability to read and write, to identify, understand, communicate clearly and effectively, and to develop numeracy, digital, scientific knowledge and skills. But education must also instill in them the curiosity, the creativity, the capacity for critical thinking, and to nurture social and emotional skills, empathy, and kindness. This is essential for developing their capacity to deal with complexity in an increasingly uncertain and interconnected world. Second, they must learn to do. As the world of work undergoes rapid and fundamental changes, so must education change to prepare every person for the challenges of the future, including the green, the digital, and the care economy, and offering them lifelong learning opportunities both in formal and in informal education. Third, and this is a bigger challenge for educational systems, they must learn to live together. In a world of increasing inequality, rising tensions, conflicts, or as we're seeing today, of wars, fraying trust, weakened democratic culture, and dramatic environmental crisis, education must help us to live better with each other and with nature. This has to do with ethics, equality, and justice. It has to do with civic responsibility, democracy, and human rights, with the respect, understanding, and enjoyment of our rich human diversity, and of course, with our capacity and active commitment as global citizens with the goals of confronting poverty and inequality, of promoting respect for the environment, and pursuing a fair and sustainable development. Of particular importance here is developing the unabashed respect for human rights, and not just tolerance, as we sometimes say. It's not just about tolerating, it's about the enjoyment of human diversity in all its forms. In particular, education must promote gender equality. This requires a gender-sensitive curriculum that promotes sex and affective education, addresses gender-based prejudice, norms, or stereotypes, empowers and equips learners to combat violence against women and sexually diverse persons, and ensure adequate sexual and reproductive health for all. And finally, and this is something educational systems very often forget or underestimate, students must learn to be. The deepest purpose of education lies precisely in learning how to live well, instilling in learners the values and the capacities to lead a meaningful life, to enjoy that life, to live it fully. Education must expand every learner's potential for creativity and innovation, their capacity to enjoy and to express themselves through the arts, their awareness of history, the diversity of cultures, and their disposition for leading a healthy life, to participate in physical activities, games, and sports, and so on. So when we have this more holistic understanding of education, we see that it is a key enabler for every person's right to be an active, productive, significant, and satisfied member of society. Education implies both their right and their responsibility to contribute to society, to be active citizens, to be productive and creative workers, to be caring family members, to be good friends, to be able to lead a meaningful life and to enjoy it. That's what education is supposed to produce: people capable of living together well. And that's why we said at the summit that to achieve these things, to solve both the access crisis to education and this more deep and fundamental crisis in terms of the quality and relevance of learning, we need to transform education. And we summarize this in a few topics that are critical. In order to confront this crisis, to advance towards this holistic education and truly learning society, education must be transformed in the following senses. First, about schools. Schools must be available and accessible for all, but that is not enough. To be truly inclusive, schools must become safe, healthy, and stimulating learning environments that support equality and inclusion for all. We must confront and revert every kind of exclusion affecting those marginalized or underserved, such as rural populations, low-income households, migrants, refugees, displaced persons, and people experiencing discrimination on the grounds of disability, ethnicity, religion, sex orientation, or gender identity. So we need better schools. We also need more and better teachers. Teachers are the cornerstone of education, and they will remain the key to effective quality learning. But the teaching profession shares in the crisis of education. We face not only a shortage of teachers and of quality teachers, but also a weakened position of teachers in society and with respect to their students and their families. To confront the shortage of quality teachers, the answer should be apparent to any person trained in economics or with basic common sense. We must improve their working conditions, ensuring fair pay and fulfilling and engaging professional experience, so that teaching becomes and remains an increasingly attractive profession. But again, that is not enough. In order to transform education, teachers must transform themselves. They must go from passive and unilateral purveyors of information into active and stimulating guides in their students' increasingly autonomous learning capacity. This is not new. This is what Paulo Freire said many decades ago. The authority of teachers will no longer depend on their having more information than their students or on their punitive power through evaluation, but rather on their capacity to instill the curiosity and the love for learning in their students and to lead them into the learning adventure of becoming themselves. This has to do not just with the material conditions, but with the culture of teaching. And we face two problems here. One has to do with the fact that it sounds very nice, this being an active and innovative teacher who practices a learner-centered pedagogy and must evaluate each student's individualized learning. But it certainly is a more difficult and more demanding challenge than that of merely repeating year after year the same packages of information, using the same textbooks, the same for all students, and then assessing their ability to repeat what they were taught. Teachers are usually not prepared or not well prepared, not supported, and certainly not incentivized for this difficult transition towards innovative and learner-centered teaching. And the second problem or second challenge has to do with teachers' increasing sensation that they are losing authority and respect from their students and their families. We hear this more often. This again has to do with the need to transform the teaching practice. In a world increasingly flooded with information, with easy access to knowledge and to stimuli of all kinds, it should come as no surprise that today's students are neither impressed nor stimulated by traditional teaching methods. The old sources of authority do not work anymore. Having more information or wielding the power of punitive assessments are no longer sufficient or adequate. We need to discover new sources of authority, respect, and teacher leadership. We need a new learner-centered pedagogy, a new teaching practice, and we need educational systems that promote and reward such new practices. So we need better schools, we need better teachers. Third, we need to harness the digital revolution. Like any other type of work, teaching depends not only on the personal capacities of teachers, but also on the tools and resources with which they perform their job. For too long, these tools have remained largely unchanged in the form of textbooks, notebooks, and blackboards. The digital revolution and the explosion of digital teaching and learning resources bring great promise to confront the inequalities and inadequacies of current educational system. The promise, as UNESCO has emphasized recently, also comes with great risks. For the digital revolution to really contribute to solve both the crisis of access and the crisis of quality and relevance, it must be educationally and pedagogically harnessed. As stated at the Transforming Education Summit, Harnessing the digital revolution has to do with what we call the 3 C's. 1, connectivity, 2, capacity, and 3, content. First, to close the equity gap, we must ensure connectivity and access to digital equipment, computers, tablets, smartphones, and others. In some places, access to electricity will be a precondition for digital connectivity. Second, we must ensure there is sufficient capacity in teachers, principals, and education administrators to effectively leverage digital tools for promoting creative, evidence-based, and increasingly independent learning in their students. And third, and this is quite critical, we must ensure the production and open distribution of high-quality, curriculum-relevant digital content and resources so that they are truly available to all learners and teachers. These are typical public goods, which require a significant effort and a high fixed cost to be produced, but once they are produced, they can be widely used by teachers and students everywhere with very little or no additional cost. However, if left to the market, such resources would become artificially scarce and quite expensive, thus remaining inaccessible to teachers and poor students in many contexts. That is why we must transform digital teaching and learning resources into free and open global public goods so that their financing, design, production, and distribution are organized so as to guarantee free and open access of teachers and learners everywhere. Finally, we talked about schools, about teachers, about learning resources. The fourth thing that I will mention is that the content and method of education must also be up to the task and the challenges of today and tomorrow. Content must be relevant and open-ended. It must be contextual, both local and global, and build on the needs, the cultures, and traditions of a learning society. Foundational learning is essential, but the definition of foundational must evolve beyond literacy and numeracy in line with the changing world to include also digital skills, creative, critical, scientific thinking, and socio-emotional skills, as I said above. Education needs to move from the traditional model of rote learning, still prevalent in many places, to a more active approach based on cooperation, collaboration, solidarity through activities such as project-based learning, collaborative methods, group problem solving, critical thinking, and inquiry-based learning focused on contemporary issues. Assessment should also be formative to reflect these pedagogical goals in ways that promote meaningful growth and learning for all students. Okay, so we know what it takes to transform education. More and better schools, more and better teachers, connectivity capacity, and the content necessary to harness the digital revolution, and the promotion of a much more relevant curricular content and a learner-centered pedagogy. But we need it at scale. The right to education, if it is to be truly a right and not merely an aspiration, must be real for every person in the world, especially every young person. And yet, with almost 250 million children and youth out of school today, we are far from reaching that goal. We might think that the challenge is too big to tackle. According to the Global Education Monitoring Report, today, low and lower middle income countries face a $97 billion annual financing gap to achieve SDG 4, a goal of universal quality education by 2030. It is true that $97 billion is undoubtedly a large number, but we would be wrong to assume that it is out of reach. Today, we invest over $5 trillion per year in education in the world. That is about 6% of global GDP. So the 97 billion gap represents about 2% of that total, which means that the paradox of educational investment is also a paradox of unequal investment. There are stark inequalities within countries, with many of those most in need of free and good quality public education are the ones receiving less effective access and support. But there is also a glaring global inequality of educational investment. And let me give you a few numbers. Even though most children in the world live in low and lower middle income countries, most of the world's educational investment is concentrated in high income countries, which account for 63% of global investment in education, but attend only 10% of the school-age population. Next, we have upper middle income countries. They have 29% of global education investment and 15% of the school-age population. Very different is the situation of lower middle income countries, which with only 8% of global investment must serve 50%, half of the world's school-age population. And finally, low-income countries try to educate 25% of the world's school-age population with only 0.6% of global investment in education, which represents merely 0.03% of global GDP. Put it in very simple terms, as of today, what we're saying is that 3/4 of the world's school-age population receive less than 10% of global educational investment. This unequal distribution of educational investment translates into a global reproduction of educational inequality, as the amount of resources each country can invest per school-age person greatly diverges. And here, again, the numbers are very clear. By 2020, per capita spending in education was over $8,500 per year in high-income countries. $8,500. It was about $1,000 a year in upper middle-income countries. It was only $300 per year per person in lower middle-income countries and $50 per year in low-income countries. That's $1 per week. On average, poor countries invest $1 per week per school-age person. Such educational inequality reproduces social, economic, and political inequality. In the low and lower middle-income countries, the challenge of educational investment can only be solved if the national effort is substantially complemented by international cooperation. For countries that are investing from $50 to $300 a year per person, even doubling their national efforts as they should would not be enough. Against this backdrop, the UNESCO World Bank Education Finance Watch shows that overseas development assistance to education fell by 7% from 2020 to 2021. The international community must step in, reverse current trends, and make the difference. In most countries, however, this investment can and should be financed with national resources because it makes sense to do so. Investing in education, as I said at the beginning, should be seen not only as a moral and political imperative, which it is, but it should also be understood as a sensible economic investment. As I said at the beginning, there is plenty of evidence that education pays. The World Economic Forum recently summarized such evidence, arguing that a single dollar invested in education at the primary and secondary level yields an estimated $2.50 in additional gross lifetime earnings in lower middle-income countries, and as much as $5 in lower-income countries. That is a 500% return of investment. You don't find better investments. And these are only the private returns. If we were to add the economic impact of indirect benefits of education, we would find, for example, that every dollar spent on early childhood development yields $13 in economic returns in the long term. But it's not only a question of investing more in education, which we certainly must. It is also a question of investing better, that is, more equitably and more efficiently. As a simple example of how investing better can make a large difference, a recent paper by Angrist and colleagues makes the case for what they consider two highly cost-effective educational interventions. One is structured pedagogy, which they define as a coherent package of inputs like textbooks, lesson plans, teacher training, and ongoing coaching of teachers that work together to improve in-class teaching. And the other is teaching according to learning levels rather than age or grade. And they show that if they were to be deployed uniformly to reach 90% of the students in lower and lower middle income countries, these interventions would cost on average $18 per student per year, generating $65 in benefits for every dollar spent. In their words, and I quote, "Our result shows that increasing education expenditure by just 6% could increase learning by 120% if directed towards these highly cost-effective interventions." So yes, the figures that we would need to be invested for every potential learner in the world to have access to a decent education are large, but they are not that large as to grant the assumption that we can't do something about. Yes, we could if we really wanted to. And this brings me to the final part of my presentation, which is asking a simple question. Why is it then that if we know all of this, countries do not invest more in education? Why don't they invest a higher proportion of their GDP or their national budget? Why don't they increase their investment per student and per school-age person? Why is there such a strong opposition for a progressive revamping of tax systems that could increase the tax to GDP ratio and open more fiscal space for the financing of education? Because it sounds absurd. To answer these questions, we need to understand that there is a very strong relation between the style or the model of development a country has and the kind of education that comes with it. And it is a relation that goes both ways. Putting it in very simple terms, when a country is highly unequal and has a large supply of very cheap labor, as many of our countries, it can find itself in what economists call a low-level equilibrium, or more simply, a poverty trap. What is a poverty trap? It results from a typical vicious cycle. Market economies work through incentives, and so the type of investments most easily attracted by the abundance of cheap labor are typically unsophisticated investments with low capital intensity, low productivity, little need for human capital. But still, these investments can be very profitable in the short term, not because they contribute with increasing productivity, but because of their continued access to low-cost human and natural resources. Insofar as labor remains cheap and abundant, there is no need to upgrade productive processes, to introduce more modern technology, or to increase productivity. And then, there is no need for a better educated working force. There is no need for human capital. With no need for an increasingly qualified labor force, of course, there is very little incentive in such an economy for raising taxes to finance education, which is perceived as a mere expenditure. Insofar as wages remain low, there would be little economic incentive to dedicate resources to increasing the human capital of workers. The situation can be even more complicated when countries get entangled into so-called typical race-to-the-bottom strategies, where they deregulate the labor market, the exploitation of natural resources, devalue their currencies, and grant generous tax exemptions to further reduce costs in order to attract foreign investments. So to attract foreign investments, we give tax exemptions, and then we don't have fiscal space for education. As Acemoglu and Robinson and many others before them have argued, in countries where these extractive or low productivity economies prevail, the institutional framework tends to be weak, and the balance of economic and political power is significantly skewed towards the upper echelons of income and wealth, which again tend to oppose the kind of progressive tax increases that would be necessary to finance universal quality education. Education is the only way out of a poverty trap, but poverty traps curtail the capacity to invest in education. Even though, in the long run, for most of the population, such an investment would make social and economic sense, short-term profits will not allow it. The combination of the interests of global capital with those of the local elites conspire against significant progressive tax reforms capable of widening the fiscal space, and especially against those reforms aimed at curtailing the capacity for eluding and evading taxes at a global level. As stated by the UN Secretary General, such transformations will require effective international tax cooperation to promote the need to address tax evasion, aggressive tax avoidance, money laundering, and illicit financial flows, and to improve and build confidence in tax systems. And in this respect, the vote yesterday for bringing the tax discussion to the UN, as promoted by the African countries, is a great step forward. So, in order to achieve sustainable development, we must solve the educational paradox. We must transform education, but in turn, to transform education, we must also break free from perverse poverty traps and race to the bottom strategies. We need to reverse gears. We must provoke a race to the top. If we are to unlock the transformative power of education to tackle global challenges and inequalities and promote a more dynamic, fair, and sustainable development, we must do three things. We must invest more in education, increasing not only the national and public effort as reflected in percentages of GDP and domestic budgets, but increasing real per capita investment in education. Second, we must invest more equitably in education, making sure that the most vulnerable 40% of potential learners in every country has access to quality and relevant education. And third, as I said, we must invest more efficiently in education, taking advantage of what we already invest and magnifying its results through proven methods of effective teaching, assessing, and learning, such as well-structured pedagogy, phonological consciousness, collaborative problem solving, and so on that we all know. This will take vision, and more than that, it will take a movement capable of altering the balance of power for a country to break free from these poverty traps, embarking on a true race to the top, not a race to the bottom. A race to the top capable of taking advantage of the virtuous cycle of fair and sustainable development, increasing wages, increasing productivity, expanding and improving education, making a sustainable use of natural resources, and strengthening political institutions. In the race to the top, education broadly understood emerges both as a key instrument and as an objective in itself. That is the challenge that we have, and that is why we've said that we really need to transform education and to transform our own development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonardo, for this panoramic vision of issues as they are considered from or by the United Nations, and very specifically of the summit Transforming Education. I have three questions here that I would like to pose now, and I will say them in their order. I will ask the first question, and after your answer, I will pose the other two. The first question has a lot to do with the final part of your presentation. You described a very impressive panorama in terms of being tragically impressive of inequalities in the world. And these inequalities are certainly on the roots of many problems of education, but they're also on the roots of many of the problems of the world as these problems are advancing in recent decades and specifically in recent years. And my question is, I know it's a difficult question, but for those of us who are in New York, in the United Nations, is it still possible to expect international cooperation, multilateralism, a strong contribution to fight against these inequalities in the world and to help those countries that face more difficulties to get closer to the investment levels and the quality levels of education that are an obviously terrible and dramatic factor as inequalities are defined in the world. So my question is about the role that we still can expect from international cooperation and more specifically from the United Nations.
Well, it's really a very difficult question, and when we were at the summit, that was one of the questions you said. We do a summit, we discuss, we have all these conversations, we seem to have the problem solved, we listen to the experts, and it seems that this is a problem that has a solution, and I was talking precisely about that. But of course, the context is not ideal, and when we look at longer term perspective, the history of the 20th century saw quite an interesting process from the mid 20th century to the 1980s, where we saw an increase in international cooperation, we saw a reduction in inequalities, a strengthening of social services and public services, of public education, public health in many countries, and here including rich countries, and in many less developed countries, there was also like this attempt at improving the conditions of the people and transforming education. Some countries were quite successful. We could remember the East Asian miracles, where they actually did both things. They transformed their education and they transformed their economies at the same time, and they went from the vicious cycle of poverty to a more virtuous cycle of more equitable growth. After the 80s, what we have seen in the world, and there is a whole list of economists that have been doing research on this, is an amazing increase in inequality, a weakening of public institutions, a deterioration of public services like public education or public health, and a huge pressure against let's use the bad word, against taxes. We don't want taxes, so what we have seen is a reduction in taxes in a lot of places, and especially something that in all our countries we see is that there is this contradiction that we have national governments, but we have global economies. So it's very easy for global companies not to pay taxes. And that creates this problem, and I always have this strange feeling when I discuss this with my friends at the World Bank or the IMF of finance ministers, that they say we don't have fiscal space for increasing educational spending, or we don't have fiscal space for increasing health benefits. Well, fiscal space is not a data. It's not a fact. Fiscal space is a political decision. So when your question is what can we expect from the UN and international cooperation and multilateral entities, I would say two things. One, and I mentioned it in my presentation, that for the lower income countries, we need increased financial cooperation. It has been diminishing, and that's unacceptable. So one of the things that should happen is that international investment in lower income countries' education and health must increase. And that is one task that, of course, the UN has called upon itself, and the idea of a global compact for financing social development is so important. But for many countries that could find these resources in their own domestic budgets, if they were allowed to transform their macroeconomic policies, to change their tax structures, again, there is a role for multilateral institutions. And I mentioned what happened yesterday and this week at the UN, where at the initiative of the African countries, the General Assembly took the decision to bring the discussion of taxes to the UN, not to the OECD. And something that shocking that happened was that most rich countries voted against that resolution. And it's not just unfair, it's disgusting. Because what you're saying is we don't want to change the rules that make it impossible for lower income countries to tax profits. And what we have seen when you look at the numbers for the last 50 years, productivity has been increasing, profits have been increasing, but wages and public income has not been increasing. So yes, this is something that institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and of course the United Nations, have to deal with. How to make it possible for countries to have the fiscal space to finance the public goods they need. I think it's possible, but I think this is a typically political problem, and it will depend on people demanding that this happens. It will not be graciously conceded. And I was really thankful with the African countries for pushing for that discussion in the UN, which is just the first step. But basically, yes, I think there is a role for the UN and the multilaterals in this.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. We have a second question that I would like you to elaborate a little bit more. In your presentation, aligned, by the way, to what we also defend in the UNESCO report, Reimagine Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, you defended very strongly the digital world as a global public good, free access, universal access, and about and outside of market logics. I think this is a point that was very well marked in your presentation. But about the digital world, here in the room, we have a question.
Uma espécie de crença, não é? De que as transformações na educação irão ser objeto, sobretudo, da dimensão digital. Porém, na tua fala, insististe várias vezes sobre a ideia da pedagogia da cooperação, da pedagogia da solidariedade. E, portanto,
in your talk, however, you insisted on the need for pedagogy, the pedagogy of transformation, and therefore the need
goes
for
well beyond the simply digital dimensions. I would like to hear you a little bit about this. In qualitative terms, how can we expect this transformation of education to happen?
This is an excellent question, and I think that UNESCO has been doing a lot of work in this, and with which I fully agree. And I would say two things. There is no silver bullet in education. So this idea that suddenly you give tablets and computers to students and they start learning by themselves, that's just not true. And we have seen a lot of people talking about these digital gadgets as almost magic learning devices. They are not. There is no such thing. But they could be very good teaching and learning resources. And this is a very big if pedagogically harnessed, they can contribute to better teaching and better learning. And however, I find, and I mean, in the discussion we had for the summit and in the document that UNESCO presented a couple of months ago, I think there are two very significant dangers in terms of the use of digital resources in education. One has to do with increasing inequality. If digital resources only reach the upper 20, 30, 40% of students, and we have the lower 40, 50, 60% of students without access to computers, to electricity, to connectivity, to digital resources, what we will see is a growing learning gap in the world. So one of the challenges is really to make sure that the access to the technology is there for everybody. And this requires money. This is expensive. In the long term, it is not expensive, but the initial investments are huge to guarantee connectivity, equipment, training for teachers, and all those things. So one challenge has to do with equality. The second challenge that you mentioned is educational. This is a resource, as in every, not just in education, this is true in every sector of the economy. The digital, as it happened with different technological revolutions before, can be an instrument for not only doing more things, but to do things differently and better. But in order for that to happen, this should be led by education, not led by technology. And we need, and we've seen in many places examples of technology very well used and technology very bad use. And I have even personal examples. When I was Minister of Education in Costa Rica, you make a huge investment to buy these smart blackboards for teachers, and then you go to a classroom in a rural school and you find the teacher using the smart blackboard to project in PowerPoint the same things that he or she would have written with chalk in the old blackboard. That's not using the technology. So the challenge is pedagogical. How do teachers use these resources to transform the classroom? And here, I have both an optimistic and a pessimistic position here. My optimistic position goes back to Paulo Freire, and we have a lot of Brazilians today here. Freire said very simple things. He said, education should not start with answers, but with questions, and should be an inquisitive process of learning how to search for answers to the generative questions. And it was an inquisitive education. We've said that for more than 50 years, and we haven't really done it in the classrooms. Many of these technologies will allow students, if guided by teachers, not to go to the classroom to see the teacher writing in the blackboard what is already in the textbook and then learning it and repeating, but to work in their homes, to work in outside of the classroom with the computer, and then go to the classroom to discuss, to search, to debate, to solve problems. So this is an interesting use of these technologies. Again, this requires good preparation on the side of the teachers, and it requires, that I mentioned also, to have access to good digital teaching and learning resources. And the risk we have here, and this has to do with the prior question of the global entities, is that if these learning resources become market commodities that are used just for profit, what will happen is what has happened with many things, I mean, with medicines and with many things that should have been public goods, is that they become very expensive, and it's a seller's market. I always remember when I was Minister of Education, going to these international fairs of technology, everybody's trying to sell you the new magic solution. And it's about the business of selling things that will magically teach the students. So I think it's the other way around. And the project that emerged from the summit, the Gateways initiative on digital learning resources, led by UNESCO and UNICEF, poses the question from the other perspective: is what is it that education needs from digital resources, and how can we guarantee, for example, that the Egyptian project of the sort of Alexandria library for the world can work? How is it that we learn from what Uruguay has been doing with the Ceibal plan? How do we use the resources that every country produces as public goods for all other learners in the world? And of course, this goes against the business instinct making this private property, and probably the biggest challenge will have to do with intellectual property rights. This should be defined as public goods.
Muito obrigado, Leonardo.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. We have a third and last question here in the room. And after that, we will finish our session. And the third and last question goes along these lines. Our common agenda is destined to renew the educational social contract, the idea that we need to renew, reform, rethink, rebuild this social contract for education. You have already talked about this when you referred to investments, to the quantitative part, international cooperation. What we would like to ask now, because these words were very present in your presentation, the word cooperation, the word collaboration, the expression collaborative environments. We want to ask, part of this social contract, this renewed social contract, does it go through building educational environments of more cooperation, of more collaboration, of more diversity, and how, from the qualitative point of view, we can build these environments? What are your ideas about this? So that we finish with a note about school environments and about the collaborative dimension of these environments that are conducive to education and to learning.
Well, again, it's a question that has to do with huge issues, because when we say that we need a new social contract, of course we need a new social contract for education, but we need a new social contract for living together in this planet. When we look at what's happening in the world, it's really scary. It's scary what's happening in Gaza. It's scary what happens in Ukraine, but it's also scary what happens in many countries that in desperation for a social contract that is not working anymore, the social contract that was built in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, they are going for whatever appears to be different. And then you have this like political desperation that even in democratic regimes go for whatever is against the current situation, because the current situation is really, for many people, unbearable. So when we speak about a new social contract, we should put it in this larger context. With respect to education, what I was saying in my presentation is, especially in lower and middle income countries, is that we have a very difficult situation because this very strong relation between education and the economy. I started mentioning the Sakharopoulos book because I always like to poke at my friend economist, because we say that education pays, that human capital has a very high rate of return, and it's like irrational not to invest in education when your econometric models say that this is the investment that has the highest rate of return. And I think that's useful. But then again, what I said later is, okay, we know that, we have known that for 50 years, and we are not doing it. So there's something else happening. And I think that what is happening and what has been happening in the last 40 years is that we have a global economy that is taking advantage of the international division of labor to use the cheapest resources where they are to produce goods that will be sold in the upper markets. And it's highly profitable. And it's economically irrational, it's socially unfair, it's environmentally unsustainable, but in the short term, it's very profitable. I saw this cartoon in the New Yorker where you see a bunch of these guys that were now they are in heaven after the death of the earth, and they are saying, well, but the last week profits were very good. I mean, it was the end of the world, but we ended with very high profits. So, yes, we need a social contract with a new balance of priorities. I think that the economy is very important. We need an economy that functions, that works. But it is not true that for an economy to work, you need the kind of inequalities we have today. That's completely false. In fact, in terms, and this is directly related to education, it distorts education. I'll give you an example. One of the things that is happening is that you see less and less candidates going into the most sophisticated scientific fields, and more of the best candidates going to financial careers, which is crazy, because you're taking the best talent of the world and putting it in a place that will produce very little, and you're taking it away from the places where it would produce more welfare, knowledge. And that's because the incentives are quite wrong. So yes, this social contract means that we need a different kind of regulation in the world. And in terms of education, this discussion of whether to push for public education, yes, it has to be public education. It has to be public health. Intellectual property rights that I mentioned before is one key issue in this moment of where the digital becomes like the leading force. And finally, as for specifically the aspect of your question that has to do with collaboration, yes, education, of course, education has to prepare people for the world of work, and they need to know, as I said, how to do. But how to do is not just how to produce in the factory or in the store or in the economy. Learning to do also means learning how do we live together? How do we solve our problems together? How do we enjoy those aspects of life that are not commodities? And sometimes when we reduce education to the formation of human capital, we are losing from sight the role of education in teaching us how to live together, how to share the burdens, and how to share the benefits. Because what is happening now is that the same with the climate crisis. Some people are sharing the benefits of the climate crisis, and some other people will share the cost of the climate crisis. So yes, the climate crisis is about climate justice. Education is about justice, and the economy should be about justice also. So bringing back those typical UN values, which we usually summarize as human rights, I think is essential. This should be a discussion that starts again from human rights and confronts inequalities from the perspective not just of short-term profits, but from the perspective of long-term well-being, including growth and including efficiency, but not just those, including fairness and including sustainability. And yes, that's a huge challenge. And my final comment would be, what scares me is that in current times, the desperation that many people feel at their societies, their countries, their governments failing them might lead, as it did in the 30s and 40s of the past century, to desperate solutions that are even worse. And that's the danger we're living in now.
Thank you so much, Professor Garnier. Thank you, Leonardo. Thank you very much for your presentation. And we bring the session to a close with reference to human rights, precisely at a point in time where we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is a very positive note on which to end this session in reference to the importance of human rights and stressing the importance of education for the human rights agenda. I wish to thank you very much for your cooperation with us in this ongoing cycle of conferences. I want to thank all of the in-person attendees, those of us attending the event in or on the internet, the interpreters who have made this session possible through their service. And above all, I'd like you all to join us again on December 15th. In this very theater, we will have Ms. Stefana Giannini. She will be here with us in person. She is the UNESCO Under Director General, and as such, from her position, she coordinates Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 4. And if on the one hand, Mr. Leonardo Garnier is the one person who represents and evokes the thinking at the United Nations, Professor Giannini is the one person in the world who coordinates the efforts towards SDG 4. She will be here with us on December 15th, and I'd like to invite you all to join us again in the University of Lisbon in person, or to join us online as part of this upcoming seminar on the futures of education. Thank you again, Professor Garnier. Thank you, one and all. This concludes this session. Thank you all again.
Thank you. A pleasure.